Hello there. Welcome to CT Politics TV. I'm Dr. Amy Chai, and today I'm here with Dan McGrath, author of the new book, The Voter Fraud Manual. Welcome, Dan.
We're here. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So it's very, very timely that you're on the show today because here in Connecticut, we're having a knockdown, drag out ballot fraud debate in our city of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it's based on some issues with mail-in ballots, that there's some concern that some of those were done fraudulently or incorrectly, and there's been accusations flying about people stealing the election. So this is very important to us here in this state right now. And I know that it's also important to people all across the nation as people have really lost a lot of confidence in our electoral system.
Well, that's absolutely true. I think the last chapter of my book touches on that, about the crisis of confidence that we have in our election system. When polling data shows Americans' confidence in our system is at an all-time low.
Yeah.
That is a problem in itself for American democracy. If people don't have faith in it, don't have faith in their government, that leads to problems down the road, big problems.
Yes. As we have seen in the past couple of years, the lack of trust, not just in elections, but in the government, in the Congress, in the CDC, in experts everywhere. And it's scary what could happen if we lose trust in our own democracy. So before we get started talking about this topic, tell me a little bit about Dan McGrath.
I guess we'll talk about how I fell into the unlikely role of becoming a voter fraud investigator and election integrity advocate. It was entirely by accident. In 2008, I was working for a nonprofit political organization called Minnesota Majority, and we were using our state's voter rolls to conduct survey calls on the issues that were most important to voters that year.
So a polling type of a thing then?
Yeah, we were doing voter identification in the sense of identifying what side of the issues voters fell on, not show an ID to vote. Right. But it evolved into that. As our volunteers were going through the lists and calling these numbers of people that were registered voters, active voters, if they were on that list, it meant that they had voted within the last two elections. Otherwise, they're supposed to be automatically removed from the voter rolls as part of an automatic purging process of inactive voters.
Okay.
And they would have to register again if they hadn't been active for a while. But in the process of making these calls, the volunteers kept coming to me and saying, Dan, this is strange. This person is 110 years old, according to this record. And it says he voted in the last two elections. I called the number and they told me that person died like 10 years ago. And he's still on the voter rolls, and the voter rolls indicated that he voted in the last couple of elections. And this kind of thing, when you're dealing with large data sets like a statewide voter registration system, there are going to be some errors in there. We accept that.
Yeah.
Databases are notoriously rife with data errors, but it was happening so frequently that we became concerned that there was a bigger problem than just ordinary data entry problems. And so we started to investigate, after we finished our research project, how much integrity is actually in Minnesota's voter registration system. The very first thing we did was run a match between our voter registration data and the United States Postal Service. And we came back with over 10,000 addresses flagged as undeliverable by the Postal Service.
What does it mean, undeliverable? The address didn't exist?
In a lot of cases, either the address didn't exist, it wasn't a residential address. In some places, there were industrial facilities where there was no mailbox, things like that. There were public parks, freeways. We sent volunteers around at that point with cameras to take pictures of what was actually at these addresses that were flagged as undeliverable. We found all of those things that I was talking about: construction sites, sections of freeway, public parks. In some cases, they were like power transfer stations where there's no building even there. It's just like transformers and capacitors. I don't know much about the electrical power industry, but like those
So
kind of
would there be names attached to those addresses?
were their names attached to them? Yeah, yeah,
There
absolutely.
were. Okay. And so
Right.
nobody's living at the power transfer station, right?
Probably not.
Unless
I
they're
mean,
like climbing up it and like sitting on top or something.
yeah, or homeless voters just trying to come up with a vicinity that they live in or something. But there were a ton of them. So we dug in deeper on that with an investigation into election mail that came back to the
Mhm.
officials as undeliverable. This is a system that we use to verify new voters. They
Mhm.
get mailed a postcard. And if that postcard comes back as undeliverable, they get flagged for challenge in our state. And this occurs in a lot of other states too. It's pretty common practice.
Okay.
If two come back undeliverable, they'll try to send it again. Then they remove you from the voter rolls, or they're supposed to. But
Okay.
that wasn't really happening. So this really,
So
that was
were these addresses active voters? Or
yes.
just they were
Well, remember,
active
everybody
voters?
that was on our public voter CD that we got from our Secretary of State were recent
Okay.
voters. They had
Okay.
to have voted in the last 4 years, or they wouldn't even be on the
Oh, they
list.
wouldn't be on the Secretary of State list if they
Not
hadn't
on the
voted.
public.
Okay. So
We did later.
100,000, that's a lot. Okay.
Yeah, so that's what kind of drew me in to these investigations. It was
Hmm.
not ever anything I thought I was going to be working on, but it became, as time went on, my life's work. Right? Everything else that we were doing at Minnesota Majority took a sideline to we have to fix our elections.
Right.
So we found more and more problems. The more we dug, the more we found, and the more we were alarmed. And then the 2008 election happened in Minnesota, where the incumbent senator from Minnesota, Norm Coleman, had appeared to win re-election by a very narrow margin. On election night, he was up by 700 and some odd votes. But then after 6 months of recounts, the challenger, Al Franken, flipped that election in his favor by a margin of 312 votes.
Yeah, I remember Al Franken. He was a Saturday Night Live individual. And I remember when he ran for Senate, and, I remember the whole scenario. So what happened?
Recall, then Minnesota didn't have a senator for the first 4 months of that congressional term.
Right.
And the Republicans at the time were holding a filibuster on the Affordable Care Act.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democrats needed one more vote in the Senate to break that Republican filibuster and pass Obamacare into law. And with the Al Franken, Norm Coleman race still in the air, that's what they were banking on. And after 6 months of legal battles, Franken ended up flipping that election. He'd lost on election night, but managed to turn it around by about 1,000 votes and got in the Senate, and he became the 60th vote needed to break that Republican filibuster and pass Obamacare. So when I saw that, given all the research that we had already done and the potential problems with our election system, I was horrified. Wait a minute, voter fraud may have just enacted the most significant piece of legislation in the past 50 years, at least, to reform our entire healthcare system.
Yeah, there were a lot of things in Obamacare that actually changed medicine as we know it. Probably one of the most impactful things was the unfunded mandate to purchase EMR, the electronic medical record, and an Obama fund donation bundler was the person who developed Epic, which was the main system available at that time. And we were all mandated to purchase it. And now this person has got $7 billion from that. And now they're kind of funneling it right into Democrat causes. And a lot of us actually went out of business because we couldn't afford the Epic. And so that's why you can't find a primary care doctor.
It's funny how these things all kind of connect together.
Yes. Yes.
More apparent why
that was a big deal for a lot of people. I mean, it had some good points in it, like, the children to be age 26 and to be on the insurance, but a lot of it had very negative results and has prompted the growth into the venture capitalist medicine industry. So, what did you find out when
it happened? I had a very affordable, self-funded healthcare plan before Obamacare was enacted. Because
Yeah.
my work in the nonprofit sector, there's not a lot of money in that really, and I wasn't getting health care through that. So I
Yeah.
was finding my own, and I had a good Blue Cross Blue Shield package that was only costing me like $100 a month or something like that. It was very affordable and a pretty good plan. And after
Yeah.
Obamacare, it jumped up to $350 a month.
Wow.
It was an astonishing. The Affordable Care Act, affordable for who?
Not very affordable,
Not for
but
me.
but that set into motion a lot of people getting very, 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 very wealthy from healthcare, and doctors losing their private practices, and the sort of widget medicine and the charts that cause burnout. And there were a lot of problems that came from that legislation. So
And more than
tell
likely,
it,
that legislation would not have passed if it was
no,
not for voter fraud in Minnesota.
right.
Because
It was the one where they said you can't know what's in it until you pass it. So I remember that. That was the famous comment about Obamacare. But so I think we've established how, impactful this legislation was. And you investigated.
What I do now.
Yeah, you investigated the election recount process, right? What happened? What happened?
In a nutshell, what happened in the recount process is Coleman's lawyers got outmaneuvered by Franken's lawyers, who were experts in overturning elections. That was what they specialized in. They had done it successfully many times before. They had just come out of Colorado where they had overturned an election.
How do you specialize in overturning elections?
Well, in politics, I guess that's a pretty important job to look at. So they have people that are just very good at that. They've studied it well.
So how did they do that? How do you overturn an election as a lawyer?
Well, in Minnesota, they managed to convince the courts to bend some rules, and they allowed a recount. The recount is only supposed to recount the ballots that were already accepted and counted to make sure.
Right. You're just supposed to recount what you've already counted to make sure the counting was accurate.
The recounts aren't supposed to look for things like voter fraud or election interference or any kind of improprieties. Really, a recount is literally just recount the ballots.
Right.
You recount them by hand instead of the machine, and you just verify the machine count was accurate. Maybe it's off. Every once in a while, it misses a ballot or two. They're very accurate, but they can have a very, very infinitesimal margin of error. And when you're dealing with an election that was won by 700 votes, and we have 4,000 precincts in Minnesota, that could matter, that hand recount.
Yeah.
But that isn't all they did.
What did they do?
Franken's attorneys convinced our judges and election officials to go back and accept ballots that had previously been rejected.
What? How do they do that?
They were missing a signature, or the address wasn't on the envelope, or there were deficiencies that election judge looked at and said this ballot can't be counted. And these judges agreed to have those opened and counted. And strategically, the Franken campaign went after districts where they knew they had majority support for their candidate. And they got those ballots opened. In Minneapolis, for example, they had no standards for accepting absentee ballots. They just took everything, whether it was should have been rejected or not, and they opened them and they counted them. And
really? But what about the Coleman lawyers? Didn't they take their districts and count those rejected ballots too, or how did that didn't work? What happened?
They wised up at some stage as to what was happening, but it was kind of late in the game when they started playing that pick and choose your district game. And they were already way behind by the time they kind of caught on to the scheme that the Franken attorneys were running.
Yes.
And the courts, they made some questionable rulings, in my opinion, about the rules as they should be applied, and ended up favoring more often Franken's legal team.
Okay, so Franken had a better lawyer then.
Really, what it comes down to, I believe, from my observation, is that they got outmaneuvered by Franken's lawyers, and that really is the long and short of it. But at the time, Coleman's attorneys even said to the judge, and as I said, fraud isn't part of a recount process, but Coleman's attorneys said to the judge, "We haven't seen even a whiff of voter fraud in this election." And when that came across my airwaves, I said, "Wait a minute." Because at Minnesota Majority, we had been doing this research. And we had just started digging into whether ineligible felons voted in that election. And we found concrete proof that in fact many had, over 1,000.
Over 1,000.
The ultimate margin of victory for Franken was 312 votes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We had evidence, concrete evidence of at least 1,000 felons having voted illegally in that election. So that
So wait a second. If you can count rejected ballots and then like ignore ineligible voters, how does that work, like in a court of law?
Well, here's a problem with finding ineligible voters after the fact. Ballots are anonymized as soon as you put them into the ballot box. So if you find out 1,000 ineligible people voted, you can't go fish their ballots back out. You don't know whose is whose.
So you can't tell, you can't pick them all out and say, oh, they voted like 60% for Franken and 40%. You can't do that.
There's no reasonable way to correct that error after the fact.
Oh, I see.
So
okay.
After the fact, you can potentially, if you can prove enough fraud has taken place, this has happened before, you can have the whole election thrown out and redone.
Oh, wow.
No, that's happened in extreme cases. There are a couple cases about that reference that in my book, the voter fraud manual. So it has happened. It's very rare. It's an extreme measure.
Yeah.
So the fraud has to be overwhelming, and the judge has to be convinced that there's no question at all that fraud influenced the election. Then they'll order a new election.
Okay. So actually, I mean, the felons voting, that's voter fraud without a doubt, but you can't pick that out after the fact.
No.
And then, so that was supposed to be just a recount. And it turns out that getting the judge to let you count only certain areas of already rejected ballots, that isn't fraud either, because the judge said it was okay.
Well, sure.
But it goes against the standard procedure or the law. I mean, you don't recount
the letter and the spirit of the law. They were making things up as they went along during that Coleman-Franken election. It was a mess. And the end result was Franken replaced our incumbent senator, became that 60th vote, and made Obamacare possible.
Interesting. So I'm sure that the party was, unleashing all of their, best, wellest finance lawyers to try to make that happen then, right? Yeah, that's kind of disturbing. What about those? Was there any of those people that had addresses that didn't go anywhere? Were they voting in that election too, or how do you know?
Oh, absolutely. So our research into the postal verification cards found 6,000 people voted in that election and then subsequently were flagged for challenge because their address didn't check out. So they used election day registration.
Mm-hmm.
They gave an address where they said they lived, a name that they said was theirs, didn't necessarily have to provide any identification to prove they lived there, but that's what the name actually was. And then the government flagged them as a potential problem, so that the next time they go to vote, they will have to provide some identification or swear an oath.
Oh, I see.
That they are who they say they are and live in the precinct they say they live. But their vote already counted, and there's, again, once it's in the box,
you can't tell, and you don't know how they voted. You don't know how they voted. So theoretically, you could go and do a provisional ballot, like with your name, with any name, like Donald Duck or something, and a fake address like the radio tower or whatever. And all they would do is flag you for the next election. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how it works in Minnesota. Yeah.
Okay.
Once fraud is detected after the fact, there's nothing that can be done about it. You could potentially prosecute the person if you can find them. But if they provided you a false name and a false address, if they wrote down Mickey Mouse on their voter registration card, the FBI or your local officials are not going to go find Mickey Mouse.
No, they're not. It's if you don't write your own name down, how would they tell? How would they know, right?
Yeah. So the number one rule, if you're going to be a voter fraudster, don't use your own name.
I'll remember that one. Yeah. So they can't go back and undo fraudulent voters after the vote has already been done.
And that's why I reached the conclusion that we need to have photographic identification or some kind of really solid
Yes.
biometrics movie. We could use a retinal scan or a palm print or fingerprint, something that positively identifies the voter so we know that they are who they say they are.
Yeah.
I can't see any other way to avoid that kind of fraud
Right.
without. We
Yeah.
we hope to catch it before it happens, because after the fact it's too late.
That's true. I mean, yeah, and everyone has, well, most people have IDs. You know, I have a lot of homeless patients at my methadone clinic, and they all have IDs or they wouldn't be there. So, you know, even the, you know, people who are really struggling can have IDs as well. So, you know, maybe the solution for that would be, you know, low cost free photo IDs for people if they really don't have a photo ID.
Absolutely. You know, the standard for voter identification in the United States was kind of established when Indiana enacted their voter ID law in 2005. They were the first state to really take this seriously and do something about preventing fraud. And when it was challenged, inevitably, it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and they established some basic guidelines for how this has to work. And Indiana's voter ID law meets all of those requirements.
Yeah.
Essentially, they said if you're going to ask for photo ID, you have to provide one at no charge to the voter. And so every state, the Supreme Court has established this as a guideline for everyone back in 2005. So every state since that has enacted photo ID requirements provides a free ID, and that can help people.
Yeah, I mean, people need IDs. People need them. I mean, I think that's actually a great idea, and that would eliminate all different kinds of fraud.
Yeah, and at a very minimum, I mean, you can still use a voter ID card and go and vote if you're, say, convicted of a felony.
Right.
And you're ineligible in your state because of that, or if you've been put under a guardianship where the court has found you mentally incompetent, you still have an ID.
Yeah.
Right. But the ID at least establishes that you are who you say you are.
Right.
So you can use that ID with an electronic system in the polling place to check to see if you're on lists of known ineligible voters, like convicted felons or non-citizens and things like that. So the ID, you know, it can both establish who you are and then provide an avenue for verification on all the other things that make you eligible to vote. And if we find out that you voted illegally, well, we know for sure that you're not Mickey Mouse. We know who you are, and you know, we'll be able to prosecute better. So there are all kinds of benefits to using identification to vote.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it would be hard to. I've heard a lot about how discriminatory it is to have a voter ID, but
I find that offensive.
It's like, why is it discriminatory? I don't understand. I mean, you can discriminate if someone's cheating, and that would be a good thing, but I don't know.
Right. But I mean, to imply that someone is less capable of obtaining a free ID because they come from a certain ethnic background it should be viewed as quite offensive.
Well, I would think it was offensive too. Yeah.
I find it so. I think that I would be quite insulted if somebody said, well, those white guys, they can't even get a hold of an ID, so we can't possibly have that requirement. You know, I'd be pretty upset by that. So wait a minute, no, I can get an ID. It's not that hard.
Yeah. So I read in your book where you were talking about some watchdog agencies, like I believe you said the Brennan Center for Justice. And
watchdog, I don't know if I call them that. I call them the fraud denial industry.
The fraud denial industry. Why do you say that?
Yeah, because there's a cabal of these organizations that includes the Brennan Center, unfortunately, the League of Women Voters, sometimes the ACLU, particularly the Minnesota chapter, was all up in trying to oppose photo ID. These are groups that kind of get together on their talking points and they parrot one another and all insist that voter fraud does not happen in the United States.
Right. Yeah, and I noticed on their website, they said, you know, they measured like people who voted who weren't who they said they were. But it looked like that was the only thing they were testing for.
Well, yeah, that's one of the tricks that they use in talking about statistics on voter fraud is they get very specific. They will only call one particular act of illegal voting voter fraud, and that is stealing someone else's identity to vote with it. That's the only thing they call voter fraud. Felons vote, if ineligible wards of the state who actually, our ballots are cast for them by their care provider or relative or something like that illegally, that's not voter fraud in their view. When non-citizens vote illegally, that's not voter fraud in their view. All those things are, of course, fraudulent votes, but they only look at one narrow little segment to kind of skew their statistics.
I see. Yeah, there's lies and statistics.
What I mentioned, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting that they do it that way, because what you define, and if you define it, I used to debate, so I know how you define the terms, oftentimes will like determine who wins the debate. So if you define voter fraud as just people taking someone else's ID to vote, then you're probably not going to find a lot of episodes of that, because that's not the most common way that people would probably commit fraud.
No, and it's extraordinarily difficult to detect and prosecute after the fact.
Yeah.
Because if you do, in fact, borrow someone else's identity to vote, when researchers go back to look at the voter rolls, all they're going to see is that the person voted.
Right.
So if they are eligible to vote and they're still alive, maybe they did vote. There's no way to know that they didn't, except maybe comparing voter signatures, and that's kind of a subjective thing that gets iffy. But when you're talking about people who are convicted of felonies, well, there's a government list of people who are convicted of felonies. So you can compare that to the voter rolls and easily see if there's a match.
Right.
So that's kind of a simple type of fraud to detect. And that's why they don't want to look at that. That's not fraud in their view, because we can actually find that.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
When someone votes after they're deceased, we can find that too. We have records of people who've died. We can compare that to the voter rolls and find out. And we have found that dead people vote too.
Zombie voters.
Yeah, well, of course they're not. No one's shambling out of the graveyard to make it to the polls right after Halloween, coincidentally, usually when election takes place. It's someone else that's just using their name to vote fraudulently. So
what I was hearing when I was reading some of the information actually about our issue that we've been having here in Bridgeport about accusations of mail-in ballot fraud. I'm wondering if you can give me any insight into what type of ways people would commit fraud with mail-in ballots, and what we should look for. What are they going to be looking for at the police station?
Well, after the contentious Bush-Gore election, a bipartisan commission was established to look at how we can improve America's election systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it was headed up by former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker. And their commission found on a bipartisan basis that the most obvious avenue for voter fraud was mail-in ballots.
Really? Okay.
The biggest vulnerability in our election system was mail-in ballots. And I believe that remains true, except perhaps the new ballot drop boxes that are being used for ballot harvesting in a lot of cases. But it's a similar principle. It's where you can drop off a lot of ballots at once, that you don't have to show up in person and meet with another individual watching you do it.
Right.
So when you can put them in the mail, it's kind of anonymous who put them in the mail. You can drop them in one of these ballot drop boxes. Who dropped them there? We don't know. So the way fraudsters can take advantage of this is if they get a list of voters, and in Minnesota and many other states, that list that you get of voters will tell you if they voted in the last election or not. And you can get a voter history in Minnesota that will go back for decades of what elections they participate in. Maybe they only show up for presidential elections and they don't vote in state elections. If you know that pattern and you want to make sure that they vote for your guy in a state election, you fill out a ballot in their name, you put it in, and it'll never be noticed because you know that person's not going to show up for that particular election. Or you get a list of people who are recently deceased. Or you can conduct survey calls like we were doing at Minnesota Majority. One of the questions pollsters always ask is, how likely are you to vote in the upcoming election? If you say not very likely, well, okay, there's a name we can use. They
Oh
fill out,
my goodness. I've gotten those calls.
fill out an absentee ballot in that person's name, send it in. There's, if they do find, well, there's 2 votes from this person, they're not looking for the guy that actually did it.
Oh,
The name of the
so
person
the person would get blamed for fraud even if they had no idea?
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So that because there's no one watching you do the crime, and you can submit multiple ballots at a time, mail-in ballots are a very tempting avenue for fraudsters.
So how would they know how many fraudulent ballots they would need to have? Is there a way they can predict that?
Well, just with polling, generally. If you have insiders, like Philadelphia had a former congressman running a voter fraud ring and had insiders working in the election departments reporting back to him on how the vote was going. And he would feed instructions to election workers on which candidates needed a little help. And then they would feed in extra fraudulent ballots for those candidates to get their tallies up.
Wow. So they had the fraudulent ballots all ready to go, and then they would slide them in.
Yeah, or they just
when
go
they need.
right there in the precinct and slip them in when no one was looking.
Interesting.
There was a case, one of the election judges that was in Michael Myers' employ in Philadelphia admitted to just standing in a voting booth when there was no one else around, feverishly filling out ballots as fast as he could, and then stuff them all into the machine when no one was
Oh
looking.
my gosh, that's horrible. Yeah.
And this is, an actual election official, an election worker in the polling place, trusted by the people to conduct an impartial election, stuff in the ballot box.
Oh,
So yeah, there are very sophisticated ways that fraudsters can know exactly what they need. Or if you're contesting an election and you have a recount going on, like in the case of Franken and Coleman, they knew how many ballots they had to shift.
Right.
They knew which ones to go after to get the numbers that they needed to win. And the same thing can happen just by having a box of ballots mysteriously appear. Oops, we forgot these ones.
Yeah.
Where did they come from? I don't know. They were in the corner over there. We forgot to count them. We got to add those to the total. So that's another way that you can know what number you need and make up that number.
Okay. So it's really interesting because a few years back, I guess it was 2019 election, we had 3 individuals from the same town, Bridgeport, that were actually convicted of mail-in ballot fraud.
I saw something.
But they couldn't tell if it had affected the election. So the election stood even though there was clear ballot fraud. So that's problematic too. When you can't, it's really hard. It's really hard to tell if it did swing the election or not. Apparently, when it was investigated by the FEC.
I would think generally you would have to demonstrate proof that the number of fraudulent ballots exceeded the margin of victory in that election. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty high bar to meet. And even then, it's not rock solid proof that the fraud swayed the election because you don't know which side the fraudster voted for.
Right. So those 1,000 felons, you have no idea which side they voted for.
We have a pretty good idea because statistically, people that are ex-cons that come out of the system and then get their right to vote back, they've been surveyed on what their voting proclivities are, and 90% of them vote for Democrats.
Oh, really? So it's 90%. Okay.
Based on that, we can make a pretty good interpolation on what was likely to be the result. But still, that's not for sure.
Yeah, you never know. You never know how they're going to vote, and so. Yeah. And so in Minnesota, how long do they have to wait after being released? How long do they have to wait before they get their vote back?
Well, we've just changed that. An organization that I used to work for called the Minnesota Voters Alliance has sued to overturn the new legislation that gives felons the right to vote as soon as they are released from jail.
Okay.
So the way our Constitution is worded, felons are restored to the right to vote once all of their civil rights are restored. And that includes automatically in Minnesota once they have completed their complete sentence. That includes parole or probation.
Parole or probation, yeah. So as soon as they've finished paying off their debt to society, then all of their rights come back.
All of them, yes.
Including,
the legislature this last year enacted new legislation that gives them the right to vote upon release from jail, even though they're on probation still. And the thing of that is, Minnesota is a probation-heavy state. We don't incarcerate here. So
I see. Okay.
The majority of a convict's sentence will be served out of jail.
Right.
And so they want to restore their right to vote early. If they're out on the streets, they say, well, they should be able to vote.
Especially if they're in jail for voter fraud.
Well, I mean, this is kind of as an aside.
Yeah.
It makes you think, because this was 100% a Democrat initiative. And they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts and compassion for the felons. They'll say that.
Yeah.
They're doing it because they believe these are votes that are going to go their way.
Oh, well, if it tilts to their side, then it's to their advantage.
Right. And I think that kind of says something about the party when you look at who they think their voters are likely to be. You know, they're trying to get younger and younger voters legal to vote. They want non-citizens to vote. They want felons to vote. Those are your constituents, you know, children, felons, and non-citizens. I think it says something about the political movement that's who they think.
Yeah, I think, you know, I would predict that in a blue state, I mean, we have blue states and we have red states, and wherever you have a party that controls the state so firmly, I would suspect that there's a certain amount of willingness to look the other way for the party that controls the state. That would be my guess.
Well, sure, if it serves their purpose of staying in power, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, because it seems like there's a lot of interest in staying in power. So I noticed in up in the Congress, there has been put a bill, and it's called the Freedom to Vote Act.
Oh, yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell me what you think about some of the provisions in that act. Do you think it's good, it's bad, it has some good and bad? What's your opinion?
Well, from only a preliminary skimming of that bill, it appears to be a watered down version of HR 1 from a couple of years ago that essentially was a federal takeover of state elections.
Okay.
And I'm opposed to that on a number of levels. Elections are state business. Even when we vote for president, that is a bunch of state elections. There is no federal election. So I don't like the federal government getting too involved in the business of deciding how election systems should work.
Right.
Constitutionally and traditionally, that has been state business. So the less the federal government interferes there, the better, I think. They have a role to play in ensuring constitutional standards are applied so that voters in similar circumstances should all be treated the same.
Right. The 14th Amendment issue, you know, is a big one.
Exactly. So the federal government has a small role to play there to enforce constitutional equality requirements over our election systems. But they shouldn't be in the business of dictating whether, for example, felons should be allowed to vote in the state. That's state business. As I said, that's in our state constitution here in Minnesota, and many constitutions throughout the state or throughout the country. They shouldn't be in the business of deciding what kind of identification is acceptable, or if any identification should be used when you vote, and other things that are in this bill. I don't believe are business of the federal government.
So when we're really thinking about trying to make elections safe and secure on the one hand, and to make it easy and fair for everyone to have the opportunity to vote, sometimes there's a little tension between those two things. What are some ideas that you have to restore trust in our process?
Well, Yeah, that's unfortunate that people tend to take one side or the other, that it's either easy to vote or it's hard to cheat. And we can have both. I think it's critical that we have both. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive concepts at all. Now, one of the provisions in the federal bill is to require states to have election day registration, right? Which to a lot of states, that would seem like an alien concept. The reason we have advanced registration is so that the state has time to validate things like, send out that election mailer to see that
Mm-hmm.
your address is legitimate, that it
Right.
doesn't go back as undeliverable mail. So now
And
we
that's what
know.
you're saying about like the fake name and address. It's already counted if they deem it later to be a mistake, right?
Right. So yeah, usually 21 days or so is what's required before an election to register. So they have time to run these checks, check your address checks out, make sure you're not on a list of convicted felons or known non-citizens or wards of the state that aren't mentally capable of voting, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there are ways to do that instantly now with technology. So I'm okay. We have election day registration in Minnesota, and we can make it work better by using technology. Electronic poll books to replace those paper rosters that you sign in on.
Mm-hmm.
You can take your ID,
Yeah,
swipe it.
they're like flipping through the book and looking for your
Yeah,
name. So there has to be a better way than that.
yeah, and the electronic poll books, in my view, are the way to go. So you have a
Yeah.
laptop, you scan somebody's ID when they walk into the polling place, it instantly populates their voter registration form if they're filling one out for the first time, or it finds their voter registration record. Then it
Oh.
checks, are they on one of these lists that makes them ineligible to vote? And if it goes, nope, they're not on these lists, yeah, the address checks out in the database, it's a real address. That address is in this precinct. Bing, they're approved to vote, they get their ballot, just like that.
Wow.
Instantaneous information. Now, unfortunately, no one is really utilizing this system to the full extent that I just described.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of thing that I advocate for both security and convenience. That's so slick for the voter. If you're an election day registrant, you've never voted before, you show up, you swipe your ID, and the voter registration form is filled out automatically for you. All you got to do is sign it, and then you
Oh,
get a ballot, and you're on your way.
that'd be great.
Long
Yeah.
lines are eliminated, and that's one of the big complaints people have. You talk about how there can be legal voter fraud. Well, one way to commit legal voter fraud is to make a polling place very inconvenient for people to use. Understaff it. Have some broken election machines or ballot tabulators in that precinct. You create long lines, and that
Mhm.
discourages people from voting in that precinct. The electronic poll book gets rid of the lines. Everything's going to happen lightning fast, and then people will be more prone to vote.
Oh, so it's both safer and it also helps people vote more easily. That sounds like a great idea.
Yes, it's both. It's
Yeah,
access and convenience and security.
yeah. Any other ideas that you have you think would work well?
Well, I think we talked before about the crisis of confidence that people have in our election system. And a big
Mm-hmm.
part of that is because our election officials are increasingly opaque about the process. And when citizen groups like Minnesota Majority, Minnesota Voters Alliance, True the Vote try to investigate our voter rolls to find things like the felons voting that we found before, they are getting refused access to the data that they used to freely provide. And
Oh,
that
can't you,
was
isn't that you can request to get that and aren't they obligated to give that to you?
ordinarily, you would think so, yes.
Yeah.
But here in Minnesota, after we released Minnesota Majority's data on felons voting, on the postal verification cards that came back as undeliverable, on ineligible wards being led into polling places for early voting and then not actually voting themselves, but other people voting in their names, we released all this data. Our Secretary of State stopped providing the information that our Data Practices Act in Minnesota requires that they give out. And our Secretary of State asserted the right to choose who he shares that data with. And so he can give it to people that are his political allies and refuse it to those that are his political opponents. And the Minnesota Supreme Court recently ruled, after this battle went on for a decade for access to this data. And meanwhile, we were getting no access to data while the court battle was raging. The Minnesota Supreme Court ultimately agreed that the Secretary of State can indeed pick and choose who to give the data to.
Really?
Really.
That sounds incredible. I can't believe that.
Well, that kind of diminishes our confidence in our election system when the transparency isn't there. And
Yeah,
it's
I mean, how
important.
can they do that?
Well, you wouldn't think they can.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
we're
that's
doing it with
crazy.
more and more in more states. Now, when Trump was president, one of the first things he did, you may recall, was establishing an election integrity task force. And their
Mm-hmm.
goal was to just investigate how big a problem voter fraud was throughout our nation's 50 separate election systems.
Mm-hmm.
And almost, well, I shouldn't say, I think it was about half of the secretaries of state in the United States refused to cooperate with data practices requests, like freedom of information requests made by this federal agency established by the President of the United States to just look at the data.
Wow.
So we're not
They
going
refuse to give the data?
to the
I
federal
mean,
government. Yeah,
the freedom of information laws are supposed to make that transparent to people who request it.
supposed to. And this is why we have a crisis of confidence. When there's opacity, when that's breeding grounds for conspiracy theories, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of like suppression of free speech. As soon as you shut something down, then the little conspiracy nuts start going crazy because they're thinking like, why are you shutting that down?
Yeah, exactly. What are you trying to hide by not
What are you trying to
providing
hide? Right.
this data?
And if there is nothing to hide, then why not give the data?
Yeah, exactly. So I contend that's one of the most important things to get our elections right is to make sure that we have 100% transparency so all sides can look at every aspect of an election and conclude, oh, yes, this was run fairly. I
Yeah.
lost, but I lost fair and square, and I can see that because I have access to all the information I need to see that.
Yeah. That sounds completely reasonable. It doesn't sound crazy, doesn't sound irrational, sounds normal, actually. I would see it would be hard for anyone to say that was a bad idea. I would
But they
think
do.
they
But they
do.
do. And our Secretary of State, I mean, he has to come up with a reason, of course, for this, why he won't provide the data. And he
And
says,
what is it?
well, it's about privacy. We don't want to invade voters' privacy. But as I mentioned, we were able to get access to this disk of voter information, and it's still available. He sells them. Our Secretary of State sells these disks for $34. And it has every voter that has voted in the last couple of elections. It has their full name, their year of birth, their address, and whether they voted in whatever recent elections. If you're thinking about your data privacy, what might you not want people to get? Like maybe your home address,
Home address and
maybe,
birth date. Maybe they could get a
maybe
credit card.
your year of birth. We don't provide the full birth date to prevent identity theft,
Right.
but they do give the year of birth so that you can break down people into demographic groups. And so to give out your phone number, your address, your year of birth, that's all fine. But what he's protecting is whether you've had postcards come back as undeliverable mail. That's information he no longer provides. What he's not allowing people to see is if someone's registered to vote or was registered to vote that was removed from the voter rolls because they were found to be ineligible. That's the data that's not being released. So that doesn't have anything to do with anyone's privacy. That only
Right.
has to do with proving fraud. That's the information that they're locking down.
Wow. Okay. That's not good. Well,
That's what we're doing, unfortunately.
yeah. So show me your book again and tell everybody how they can get hold of your book.
Well, the voter fraud manual is available from any major retailer, really. You might have to ask for it. It's not necessarily stocked, but you can get it from your favorite bookstore, or it's available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble online, any of the other online bookstores. You can get it from my website too at danmcgrath.net.
danmcgrath.net. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see what happens in Bridgeport here in Connecticut. You've heard a little bit about what can go wrong in mail-in ballots, and I hope that Bridgeport solves its fraud claims, and I hope everything turns out okay.
You've had some back and forths with the legal conclusions on that mail-in voting fraud, haven't you? Wasn't there a conviction overturned, or?
Well, they convicted, they recommended 3 people for conviction, but I don't know if they've been convicted yet. But this was 2019, and now there's actually another thing for 2023 as well.
Oh, I'm
So
maybe confusing those.
you're confusing with the 2 different years, because apparently it's happened before. Oh, Bridgeport, come on, Bridgeport, you gotta do better.
But nothing new. It is all over the country.
Yeah. I mean, because I think the people of Bridgeport deserve better. So we'll figure this out, and I think it's very helpful to talk to you to learn a little bit about some of the things that do go on, because there's a lot of people in the city of Bridgeport that they want to have their voices heard. It's not fair for them to have their voices taken away from them. And whoever is for the people and wants to work for the people is who the people should have. So I hope that it works out for them. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much. This is Dan McGrath. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time on ctpolitics.tv.